First of all, welcome to BII. In this kind of post-COVID world, it still surprises me whenever I have kind of live bodies in front of me. So it's really great to have people who've made the effort to come here for this event. I'm Colin Buckley. I'm Managing Director and General Counsel at BII. I'm fortunate enough to have business integrity as part of the remit that I work on here at BII. Today we're launching the Investing with Integrity report, a Transparency International UK report supported by BII. I mean, this represents a sort of a flagship initiative for us and for the business integrity team here at BII. And what it seeks to do is to ask fundamental questions about how integrity risk management supports BII's broader development impact mandate. So as a responsible investor, which we've been for now 70 years, with a mandate to deliver development impact, we've always sought to enable sound business integrity practices and principles in our investment businesses. It's been almost 10 years now since we had a business integrity function, but I think it's fair to say that we've been traveling a journey here. And when we first set up the business integrity function, I think it's fair to say that it was perceived as kind of a compliance cost of doing investing business. It was something of a chore, a requirement that had to be done before we made an investment. Our business integrity team has come a very long way in the past 10 years from those beginnings. Now we think of business integrity as a risk management tool. We think beyond compliance. Nowadays, we think about issues like financial crime. We think about risk governance. We think about regulatory risk, reputational risks. We focus on how to make our investees more efficient, more resilient by improving their business integrity systems. Today, our business integrity team works as a partner to our investment teams, alongside our E&S teams, to attain development impact and to manage risk in our portfolio. We also work with our investees in order to build their capacity to, in turn, monitor and respond to often endemic corruption and other business integrity risks that they face in their business and in their operating environments. How do we do that? Well, we do this by strengthening their risk governance systems, by strengthening their business integrity controls, an approach that is now set out in our policy on responsible investing, which was launched early this year. Good process, it turns out, leads to high integrity. All this work got us to thinking about how, if at all, our business integrity approach intersects with our development impact mandate. Does improving business integrity improve development impact? That was a thorny question for us. And to help us answer it, we went to Transparency International UK. I mean, we partnered with them, and we've known them for a long time, recently through their Business Integrity Forum, which we found to be a very valuable forum for sharing knowledge and collaboration about how you handle corruption risk in your portfolio. This guidance note addresses topics ranging from how to diagnose bribery risk, how to strengthen organizational values, all with the intention of tackling corruption, and as a key resource for our investees who appreciate the accessible analysis and the practical tips that the resources that the Business Forum and TI UK offers. TI's focus on the anti-corruption agenda also made sense for a report, given that we invest in emerging and frontier markets in Africa, in South Asia, and now in Southeast Asia, in places that most financial institutions flag as either high risk or, more normally now, completely no-go areas because of the corruption endemic in those countries. We were delighted when TI agreed to take up this question on how to link business integrity and development impact, recognizing that impact investors, an emerging category, don't have sufficient guidance on corruption and business integrity more broadly. The results of this first report to explore in detail the links between business integrity and ESG and development impact outcomes will give us much food for thought as we ourselves continue to evolve our business integrity practice. We're thrilled to launch this report today, and that we are joined by a distinguished panel, which will be up here shortly, and by so many of our TI UK partners and colleagues. So without further ado, let me hand over to Alex Maddy, the head of our business integrity team, to introduce this report. Alex.
Thank you, Colin. Hi, everyone. So we're really excited to get into this conversation with you all and with our panelists. But before we do that, I'm going to share a few thoughts with you about what really led us to do this work with TI in the first place, and then, some initial observations about the report. So there were three key areas that we really wanted to tackle and what led us to having these conversations with Transparency International in the first place. They were around issues like the relationship between BI and ESG, the point that Colin just made around whether we could find common standards, and then also really kind of getting to the heart of the links between business integrity and development impact. So those were the three areas that kind of got us excited about the work. And that first point about whether or not we can do more to understand the relationship between business integrity and environmental, social and governance aspects, so ESG. How does BI fit into the responsible investing agenda? That really all started for us over a year ago when we started our work on the policy on responsible investing. So we were updating our policy. And we were speaking to lots of different stakeholders at the time. We spoke to over 100 different specialists in the whole disciplines across environmental, social, governance, business integrity. And what was really interesting there is that for most of those respondents, business integrity didn't really feature in their way of thinking about responsible investing or ESG. So I think it's pretty fair to say that what we have at the moment is a real kind of a focus on ESG frameworks in the investing world in general, but probably a gap in terms of recognizing the role and significance of business integrity in corruption within ESG frameworks. And that kind of brought us to the point around collaboration. So we at BII believe in collaboration across those disciplines. We currently work really closely and well, I would say, with our colleagues who focus on E&S issues. But I can think of a time where that wasn't necessarily all the case. And there are examples of projects that we've worked on, and we look at how they've worked out, and we can see that if we'd had business integrity there from the start, maybe would have had a different outcome. So I'm thinking, for example, of a project that we invested in the DRC, in the rural area of DRC, where our ESG team spent many years having to think about sort of community tensions, health and safety breaches, and environmental breaches. And when we did start looking at the business integrity issues within that investment, what we saw very quickly was that underlying all of those poor ESG outcomes was actually sort of collusive practices and fraudulent links between employees and external community. And if we'd had that sort of joined up collaborative approach from the start, I'm pretty confident that we would have been able to get to the heart of the matter of the ESG issues quicker too. Right, so that's just one example of these links, but really the point is we were interested in how this work helps us understand those connections between BI and ESG. And the second theme was around common standards. So I think it's pretty clear to us that there isn't a framework that addresses business integrity for impact investors or DFIs. So you can think of the IFC performance standards as a really good framework for environmental and social issues. There's also a corporate governance framework that the IFC and the DFIs have built together. We don't have the same thing for business integrity. And what that means is that you get quite varied approaches in how investors think about this. And that has a burden for our investees, and it affects how they work with us. So we were really interested to see through this work whether or not we can start to think about how we might develop some of these common approaches to interpreting and managing BI risks. And the final kind of theme, and probably the most critical one that we were grappling with really, was whether or not we can explore this idea of how business integrity could or should actually be part of development impact considerations. And I think, you know, there's a recognition that a BI event or a risk, let's say a major fraud, will disrupt your development impact outcomes, you know, because that leads to a business that's going off track. It's a business that might face fines or regulatory scrutiny or reputational damage, and that's what we typically call execution risk. And I think that point is well understood in the impact investing community and often gives support to the idea that we should be proactive in how we think about good business integrity. You know, if we've got a strong business with good underlying health, we're more likely to get the outcomes that we want. And having good BI risk management systems is often a proxy for how well run a business is. But so that's kind of an important argument that I think is well understood. What about if we try and push that a bit further? Can we say that addressing business integrity directly affects your ability to achieve development impact or other ESG outcomes? So, you know, how you measure and understand development impact, does that need to factor in business integrity considerations? So if you think about that on the measuring side, at a really simple level, for example, if we were to determine that we were going to have high development impact by investing in a business that was generating a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but that company was actually winning contracts by paying bribes, is that diminishing our overall positive impacts? You know, and could it have negative consequences on our ability to actually achieve the climate impact we're looking to achieve in the first place? So in other words, how do you account for business integrity in your impact measuring? And then on the positive side of that, you know, we've seen work that we've done in business integrity through investments, say, in the healthcare sector, where we feel that the focus we've had on business integrity has directly led to better development impact outcomes. So examples in healthcare would be where we've worked, where we've seen that the existing incentive structures were encouraging doctors to actually receive kickbacks and sort of support a collusive and corrupt system. And the consequences of that was that the right kinds of services weren't going to the most vulnerable or rural populations. And in those examples where we specifically sought to address a BI risk, so in this case, trying to remove those corrupt and collusive practices, we also managed to change the models in such a way that the actual incentives provided a better medical service to those underserved populations, therefore achieving stronger development impact. So we're going to explore all of that question on how to measure impact, whether you can accept these kind of trade-offs with BI in our panel. So that's what led us to do the work with transparency. And let me just say a couple of words about the report itself. First of all, congratulations to our TI colleagues. I think it's a really practical, straightforward, clear report. So it addresses the core themes of conceptualizing that link between BI and development impact, but it's really specific and practical in its recommendations for impact investors. So I think it will go down very well. And it signals some kind of key shifts in how we think about business integrity, and that's what we're going to talk about shortly. So I just want to call out two of those key shifts that were particularly thought-provoking for us at BII. The first was saying that we really should start to conceptualize business integrity as an impact issue that's central to development mandates. So not only just think of it as a compliance or regulatory issue. So that, of course, affects how you define and understand what BI matters. So you're starting to look beyond sort of understanding the track record of who you're doing business with. You'll think about broader factors, both within the organisation or investee you're looking at and outside the investee. So Colin alluded to it, but you know, it's that shift from requiring a focus on good policy and process in isolation to thinking much more broadly about organisational culture, risk management systems, even transparency and diversity of thinking within the organisation. And the report also talks quite clearly about that and some of the areas of overlap between governance and corporate governance and business integrity. And then the other part of it is how you ensure that you look outside the organisation. So you think about the sort of operating and political context that that investment is sitting in, of course. So do you see political interference in the business model? Do you see regulatory change coming into play? That kind of thing. And the sort of final key shift I want to highlight that the report emphasises is a sort of a call to impact investors to start thinking about sector collaboration to try and disseminate good practice. And I think the value of collective action in addressing systemic corruption is now really well understood and something that's kind of talked about a lot. The report sort of shifts, the shift in the report is just really emphasizing that there should be a focus on that for impact investors, so that we have a role to play in seeking the change in BI standards that go beyond just the investments that we make, that we start to affect change at that sector and market level. So no matter where you are on your current thinking around business integrity and your approach, I think some of these ideas are really vital to consider and very forward-thinking, and we're starting to do that. So let's get into the detail of it now with our panel, and Huma, I'm going to hand over to you to chair. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Huma Yusuf. I'm a director on BII's business integrity team, and I'm thrilled to welcome this wonderful panel that we have here this morning to talk about our Investing with Integrity report that Transparency International has produced. I'll quickly introduce the panelists, and then we will have a bit of a discussion around some of the ideas that Colin and Alex have raised already this morning. But there will be time for Q&A at the end. So start collecting those questions. And we'll have roving mics in the room. Please do wait for a mic to get to you before you kick off with that. But looking forward to the discussion. So I have here with me this morning Dr. Ingrida Kerushauskaite, who is the head of business integrity at Transparency International UK. She's recently come into that role, having joined from Palladium, where she was in charge of implementing UK government programs on anti-corruption. Welcome, Ingrida. We also have Phil Mason, who is currently a member of Transparency International UK's Advisory Council, but was previously and for many, many years a senior anti-corruption advisor and sort of policy development practitioner at erstwhile DFID, the Department for International Development, focusing on the implementation of DFID programs and international anti-corruption efforts in that space. So welcome, Phil. We have Rajaa as well, who is joining us from Mediterrania Capital Partners. She is a partner there and also the Director of Sustainable Development and Risk Management. So welcome, Rajaa. And finally, Tim Gosha, who is the CEO of the Dolma Impact Fund, which operates in Nepal, but is also the Honorary Professor of Sustainable Business at the University of Nottingham, and has been doing research, recent academic research in this space of market shaping and impact investments. So looking forward to hearing more from all of you. So welcome and thank you again for your time and for joining us here at BII this morning. I'm going to kick off just sort of taking this back up a little bit to the higher level to ask you, I'll start with you, Ingrida, just to sort of remind us why when you start to talk about development impact, you do need to recenter your thoughts on issues of corruption and business integrity. What are those basic links between these two topics?
Sure, thank you, Huma. And just before I get into that, I wanted to thank BII for taking such leadership on the topic, for funding this work and working with us and really prioritizing business integrity. It was great to hear about the journey that you mentioned that BII took. And also thank you to Tom Shipley, who was lead author of the report, and all those that contributed. So we really appreciate that. On the question on why corruption matters for development impact. So I think it's been long established within academic research and practice that corruption has significant impact on various other development indicators, from violence, gender equality, social indicators, environmental indicators. Just from that perspective of if a company can bribe locally to obtain false certificates of environmental emission reductions, for example, then the investment into green energy, as you've talked about, as Alex raised the question of can you support companies that bribe? Well, if they bribe the government to obtain contracts, what else are they bribing for? And that effect on the environment of not following the emission standards, of environmental degradation, social effects, has been really established now. Also the effects on the economy. So the report goes into detail and shows how companies can do better at the beginning of their operations while they're establishing themselves if they bribe. But that's a very short-lived effect. Very quickly, they start getting into issues of having to spend more time, resource, and money on bureaucratic processes, on the bribery, and that actually has a significant impact on their ability to work effectively and to do better than those that don't. There are also significant impacts that corruption can have that are unintended consequences. So if we're talking about development impact, the unintended consequences can be very, very interesting. I'm sure we will go into that in the panel in terms of if you're trying to invest in an organization that works to improve the environmental consequences, that can have significant social labor practice effects on the workforce and the broader populations. That's a very interesting point that I'm sure we'll go into. But I think what this report and BAI's focus on business integrity really, why it really adds significant value is that positive outlook. So it actually takes anti-corruption, or the don't do bad things side of the debate, and moves it into that what positive impacts can be achieved by considering business integrity rather than just anti-corruption. And I think it's interesting how the report highlights that impact investors target SDG 16 the least out of all SDGs. And that's the SDG that has bribery and corruption targets. So it's really being deprioritized at the moment, but maybe it shouldn't. And I think in the report, we discuss how investors actually have said that focusing on anti-bribery and corruption improves companies' performance, how they have easier, cheaper access to capital, more companies are willing to invest. But also there's an interesting example I wanted to highlight of a company that focused on corruption-plagued fertilizer program within a country where there was a lot of leakage within that first fertilizer program. And by working to reorganize that system from government officials being involved in delivering fertilizer to having e-vouchers where people could pick up the fertilizer directly from merchants, they increased the yield that farmers had by quite significantly. Each farmer got $99 additionally from their maize yields per year. So it really shows that working on anti-corruption can improve the other indicators that we're trying to achieve. And I think that's quite an important point that we can really harness. I do want to qualify that by saying there is no silver bullet. Just adding technology, just adding one aspect is not going to solve this. And that's a really complicated system and process that the report also gets into in terms of understanding the broader environment in which companies operate. So what actually impacts decisions and behavior and corruption? What are the drivers and the pressures? The politics, the economy, the social elements, which I'm sure we'll get into, and are a lot more complicated than just getting a technology in place, but that can be part of a solution if well targeted.
We'll come back to that certainly, and talks about some of the practical but numerous tips and tricks that investors are going to have to rely on to start implementing some of these ideas. But I'm going to pick up on this idea that you've touched on. Essentially, the report talks about this idea of a business integrity premium, the idea that there's quite a lot of research now that shows that impact investors and the sort of companies that they invest in tend to have better financial returns where you have business integrity risk management. But I want to turn to Phil to just ask, I mean, would that be the only motivation that an impact investor would have to start to pick up these ideas of better focus on business integrity and on that SDG 16? I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on sort of more broadly why impact investors as a particular category should be thinking about these issues.
You know, what for me stands out from the report are, I think, three reasons why the link between business integrity and the activities of impact investing are so important. Firstly, it seems to me obvious, self-evident, that it's the purpose of impact investment. Impact investors have chosen to seek a bigger return, a different return, than just the financial return. And so it demands a step up on the issues that they're focusing on. Just short-term financial returns isn't sufficient for them. So that purpose, I think, defines the reason why business integrity is a bigger element for them. I was struck by the scale of impact investment. It was a niche area. I wasn't really familiar with it at the beginning of this exercise. But when we talk about the scale of between 500 billion and $2 trillion worth flowing into developing and emerging markets. When you compare that to the annual flow of, for example, classic development aid that I used to get involved in, that most recently is around 179 billion a year. So we're looking at a huge leverage. I mean, if that 500 to 2 trillion is an annual figure, I suspect it's a quantum figure overall. But we're looking at 3 to 12 times the amount that's going in from the classical aid donors, which receives much more attention than the aid donors do than impact investors. So I think that scale has a huge prospect. I was likening it to conversations outside of thinking around, if you think about the Einsteinian model of how you represent gravity, and you put that big stretch, that big rubber mat, and put a big bowling ball in the middle, and it kind of drags things in. That quantum of input going in can be a really significant lever to change. And the report identifies, as Ingrid has just mentioned, that II tends to pick up businesses at their early stage of formation. And that, I think, is significant. If you can set the weather in a growing economy at the beginning with that sort of scale, then you've got a huge chance of shaping the way in which that economy is going to change. So it seems to me that impact investors are in a prime space to influence the change in development. And as Ingrid said, it's beyond doubt now that there is a very firm positive link between integrity and development, sustainable development. So I think that's an important point. The third thing for me seems to me, when I sat and kind of listened to how impact investors talked about their activities and how we in the aid world used to work, impact investors seem to have a lot of operating advantages over donors. I mean, you can look at far longer time horizons, for example, than we in DFID ever used to look at. I mean, it was a heroic DFID project that would look 5 years ahead, for example. I mean, most DFID programs, aid programs, are 3 years. You're constantly rejigging. And of course, our programs were always subject to the vagaries of new priorities, new ministers coming in. Suddenly, the whole tectonic plate shifts to a different prospect. So there's a lot more stability, it seems to me, that impact investors can have. And I suspect that they have much more familiarity with the local working environment, the economy, than folk from an aid agency coming in, who will often be in a country, they'll be parachuted in the country, work for 3 or 4 years in that country, and then leave again. So the knowledge of the environment, I suspect, is much better in impact investors. So all of those seems to me to show that you can have a leading role. Impact investors could have a leading role in shaping the kind of political integrity weather here.
Thanks. Tim, I know that is exactly a question that you have been grappling with in your academic work, and then obviously practically seeing play out through the Dolma Impact Fund. This idea of, can impact investors actually shape the whole market in the way that they operate? It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts and some of the findings of your recent academic work along these lines as well.
Sure. I was chatting to Phil before this and was interested in your Einsteinian analogy, which I think is great, but also why both of us got involved in anti-corruption work. I think you start life in least developed countries, frontier markets, thinking, if I'm talking about Nepal, why is Nepal poor? It's got the Himalayas, it's got tourism, it should have incredible hydropower assets. Well, and then you start thinking, well, maybe it's just a lack of infrastructure. It doesn't have enough power, the roads are bad. Well, why doesn't it have enough power and infrastructure and roads? Well, corruption. And you start doing business there and you realize this systemic corruption adds so much business cost and delay that this is the number one development impact that at least I wanted to have a focus on. And so, looking at models of anti-corruption, there's been lots of top-down, sort of World Bank-driven stuff you've worked on, Phil, with the anti-corruption commissions. In terms of the corruption perception index versus the amount of aid money put into those, it certainly hasn't moved the needle. It's absolutely true, Phil, what you say about as an investor, we have a certain amount more leverage over our investee companies than perhaps an aid organisation does over a government programme. We can sit on the board, we can pull funding, we can do all sorts of nasty things. But I think my fascination has been beyond the organisation that we have some control over. So what's the effect of impact investing? I sometimes call it compliant investing or ESG-related investing. Let's just say compliant investing on an ecosystem, not just the company that's the destination for your capital. And I started to witness effects first in the Nepal banking system. In getting loans for hydropowers and companies, I noticed that it was remarkably uncorrupt. And I thought, why is this? I've just with two colleagues from Nottingham University completed a study on why the banking system in Nepal is relatively uncorrupt. And it turns out that back in the 80s, there was 3 government banks. They were all rotten, corrupt. You had to pay to open a bank account, all sorts of things. Standard Chartered comes in, they're given an international license. Other banking organizations come into the country. And simply through competitive dynamics, customers started to go to Standard Chartered and others. Why would I go to corrupt bank and pay a bribe when I can open a bank account or get a loan at Standard Chartered? I won't. So customers started to shift. And then as people started to move around, I think at the moment about half the executives in the banking sector, the commercial banking sector, have worked at Standard Chartered. So what we've tracked is this knowledge transfer throughout and how ethical behavior has spread. Also how it's affected the regulator, the central bank. So again, I do think it has to be a heavy enough ball in the Einsteinian mat that actually, if it's a tiny bank, it's probably going to, but Standard Chartered had some heft, and they were able to get a positive inclusion in the ecosystem from the regulator, which helped to reinforce, which worked along with the knowledge transfer of talent, and has created over 30 plus years a relatively uncorrupt sector. Now that's really fascinating, because if that transfers into other industries and countries, which we haven't proven, then actually we're all doing it. We're all helping in having a development impact in reducing corruption through competition, through creating industry champions by investing in them, enforcing anti-corruption, business integrity standards in the companies we invest in. Simply, if they're big and important enough, it will have or could have this effect. I'll just give you one more example. Cambodian schools, a fund called Emerging Markets International, invested in a large network of private schools. And the school network was famous for bribery and corruption, not paying taxes, and specifically bribing to get the fire and health certificates. This school paid and got proper fire and health certificates and put it front and center of their marketing campaigns. Guess what? All the children wanted to go to that school. And so now you've got a system in Cambodia where schools have to be compliant, properly compliant, in order to do that. So there's many examples of this, but I mean, the more we can prove this, there's lots of limitations. I don't think this works, as Phil correctly pointed out, for procurement with the public sector. I think it works only where you can win or lose customers based on it, but the more we can prove this dynamic effect, this sort of bottom-up market-driven effect, I think the more we can prove the development outcomes that we're having.
Those are interesting examples, because usually it's the idea of competition that creates corruption risk in particular, where it's often seen as beneficial to pay a bribe or engage in some other collusive practice in order to compete more effectively and win. And I think this is one of the most common arguments that you start to hear against better business integrity risk management by impact investors, this idea that actually, no, there are some trade-offs you have to make. You might need to behave in a certain potentially unethical way in order to ultimately have better impact, because then you are able to win the contract for the renewable energy project, for example. Phil, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this idea. That's sort of the first counter-argument that we tend to hear is that, no, you have to make trade-offs.
I had lots of thoughts because I set up a business integrity initiative in DFID shortly before before I left, largely because we saw indications that in the Brexit conversation that there was a big risk that companies would be coming to government to say precisely this, that there is a trade-off between commercial success and our integrity. And we imagined that they would put to government the kind of point that, okay, government, you can either have us going out post-Brexit, winning all contracts in dodgy stans all over the place, or you can have us behaving according to the Bribery Act. But you can't have both, and you choose. And we did some work, and we created our Business Integrity Initiative largely to try and start to set the narrative in a different direction. We did a lot of research and pulled together the evidence, which kind of goes against the concept of seeing anti-bribery, anti-corruption measures as a compliance problem, a hurdle to jump over. But actually the evidence points almost entirely the other way, that actually if companies work with integrity, they are much more likely to have sustained good business investments and deliver and achieve their own value. For example, we did a review of how companies looked at the Bribery Act, how they actually saw it in practice. And they said that although it had been a bit of a sharp shock, because as you know, it's quite a strong piece of legislation, it had made them rethink the problems of corruption in their supply chains and operating environments, and that they had really come to consider that the fact that there was this strong legal restriction behind them made them much more able to resist solicitations, particularly from the junior officials, which they were used to having to receive. They say, we can't do that, we'd love to do it, but we can't do it because we'll go to jail. And I think that was the important factor. We even found that the reputational strength of the company improved if it became aware that they were coming from a country like the UK, which at that time had a big reputation for being strong on anti-corruption. And we had an anecdote that an Asian company had actually set up a British subsidy in order to trade with Africa, because they saw it to their advantage that they were coming from a UK background, and therefore it almost protected them from the solicitations. There were lots of statistics that we dug out, which I'd like just to refer to a couple of them, because I think they point to this contrasting view. The evidence was that those paying bribes actually end up finding themselves more entrapped in future bribery solicitations than if you resisted at the beginning. They spend more time and money dealing with sorting themselves out. And it seems quite self-evident that once a company is known to be susceptible to paying bribes, then suddenly all the rules and regulations seem to be much more complicated, and you need to pay much more bribe to get round them. Firms paying bribes enjoy stronger sales in risky markets, but they become less profitable over time. Siemens apparently reported that it cost them 3% of their entire total sales went to bribery. And then the kind of percentages of profits, anywhere between an OEC studies saw 35% of profits in Eastern Europe were being consumed by corruption for those companies which were paying bribes. And companies had a growth rate of 4% lower if you're paying bribes. So actually companies who pay bribes spend more money and time distracting themselves from their actual business. They get more hassle for it rather than less hassle, and they end up being less profitable as a result. And I think that sort of narrative pushed us to kind of think around anti-corruption as being far less the kind of compliance hurdles that you have to jump over, but actually it's the pathway to commercial success. I don't know whether the BII is still, our BII in DFID, FCDO is still running. I keep hearing noises that it's quietly been evaporated, but that's what we were trying to do. And I think the evidence is there for that is not a trade-off?
So the evidence is mounting, and you've all very articulately given a narrative for why impact investors need to be thinking along this area of business integrity. This report argues for a big shift in sort of how impact investors make it central to the way that they think about development impact, and then change from a sort of proactive, from a reactive approach to integrity risks and managing them to a sort of more proactive monitoring and management of these issues. Rajaa, I want to bring you into the conversation now, because obviously it's easier to talk the talk than walk the walk. And as sort of head of risk at Mediterrania Capital Partners, I know this is a journey that you've been on as well. So just talk a bit about sort of when it comes down to the realities of doing this, what challenges are impact investors looking ahead to?
Yeah, definitely. It has been a lot of challenges actually when we started working on this area of business integrity. First, let me say that honestly, these areas were left unattended before. So recently we started working on business integrity as such, and not only concentrating on corporate governance, being like the composition of the board, independent board member, and so on, like the IFC corporate governance matrix. We were mastering all these aspects, but business integrity as such, being corruption, fraud, money laundering, and compliance crime, these areas were completely unattended before. And we often have seen that businesses we were talking to were blaming governments to have corruption in these countries or these industries, and vice versa. Governments are blaming businesses. But we had at some point to sit and explain that it has to be a whole of society approach. We cannot just sit there and blame each other. We have to fight. Each one of us has to bring something real and concrete to the fight in order for us, all of us, to go ahead and evolve in that sense. Obviously, we went from that reactive approach to a more proactive approach. First, we thought about setting legal and binding requirements in the corporate agreements that we have with that portfolio companies. So this allowed us to impose at some point how these aspects should be tackled, to bring them in the board, in the agendas of the board of directors. So this has been a game changer for us. You don't talk actually about corruption with anybody. It has to be with somebody from the senior management, with high ethics, and with power actually in the company. So just sitting there and talking with, I don't know, with a CFO or a CEO, without having the chairman or the president of that company being involved in that discussion would not make sense. The activity will still be run as it is. Sometimes I have been actually in occasions when they told me, nobody is watching. We're not public, so it happens. It's a one-off, but we had to explain to them that it's not going to be one-off. It's going to happen often and often and often. It's going to be there for always. It's been a long journey. Today we're starting actually to see more, let's say, less resilience from that companies. They are, we had actually to prove them causalities, that corruption can cause problems that will be by the end causing them, I don't know, like performance losses, reputational problems, maybe turnover issues in terms of employees and so on. So we had to go through that learning curve. We had to build capacity in these investees. First thing that we do today is that we set an internal audit control function. Obviously, it's not always the case to have an internal control or audit people in the investees in emerging market. So this has always this has been a game changer for us to have like somebody responsible on these areas. Somebody that is going to be incentivized actually on the business integrity action plan that we put in place. And finally, I would say that the quick of action, actually, everything for us as private equity fund manager, everything happens in the first or the second year. If you leave it till, I don't know, the third year or the fourth year, you don't have much of power or weight, even having board seats, 1 or 2 board seats. Everything has to be implemented during like the 100 or 120 days from investment.
It's interesting that you talk about sort of needing to find the relevant partners at the companies, and you know, you can obviously be coercive through legals, or you can sort of bring them along on this journey with you, where you are convinced that ultimately it will lead to better financial performance and better development impact performance. And one of the things that this report does is start to make this argument that you cannot talk about environmental and social performance or sort of broader ESG outcomes without acknowledging that there's a business integrity flip side to that. And I wonder in that sort of, and you know, most of the portfolio companies that impact investors will engage with will be much happier and more ready to sort of embrace this idea of having positive environmental or social impact. And I wonder whether you see that linking these two ideas a bit more closely will actually help that conversation at the company level and build more buy-in for picking up business integrity risk management more broadly as well.
I think that the answer will be obviously yes. It would certainly avoid investors to receive like a lot of and different multiple requirements from us and from like our DFIs or institutional investors. Like ESG today is embedded in the investment cycle from the beginning, I think that business integrity issues have to be alike. Just imagine that we get with the wrong company. The consequences for us could be dramatic. We could lose confidence. Our reputation would be at risk. So I think it's dramatic. We cannot afford that. I think business integrity is heavily connected to the development impact us as impact investor we are seeking. So I don't think that they have to be separated. Today there is, I would say, like 2 systems that grow in parallel, but at some point we are trying actually to merge them and to somehow set like a joint action plan that gathers all the ENS aspects that everybody today is aware of, and there is like a buying and add on corporate governance items and business integrity. Business integrity is at the heart of the debate on inequality. I think that they have to be connected and jointly considered.
Thanks, Rajaa. And I think, Ingrid, this comes back to something that you had alluded to right at the start, this idea of unintended consequences. So is this sort of what you had in mind, the sort of more holistic approach to avoid those unintended consequences?
Yes, definitely. I had a particular example in mind where very recently in a conversation with someone, they shared an example where a business found that it had quite a lot of health and safety accidents and incidents, and trying to understand why that happened. And during their investigation, they found out that quite a large percentage of the workforce was illiterate, and they hadn't understood the guidance on health and safety that management had devised with the assumption that people could read and understand it. Now, that assumption had been reasonable because the workers had to present educational certificates showing that they can read, and that had been obtained using corrupt means in some cases. So that corruption in the educational system, being able to and being a practice of obtaining educational certificates to get a job, actually meant that those people were getting seriously hurt or even dying. So I think it's that kind of an approach of understanding the broader environment where the companies operate and what are the risks to be able to support the investees to establish the right structures to mitigate them. There are a few interesting examples there that I wanted to pick up on, in particular about that longer term support that impact investors can actually give investees. Tim also alluded that initially there might be kind of an expectation to bribe, but if a company gets over that, the longer term benefits are clear. And it's that particular ability to invest longer term, as Phil said, but also the support that the impact investors can give investees to actually think through those different challenges, including through the unintended consequences, that I think is quite, puts impact investors in quite a unique place. So yeah.
Thanks. Tim, this idea is coming up again and again that sort of the better risk management will sort of support the other outcomes. But we've also talked, you know, there's examples here about just doing better in terms of corporate governance. What about those positive outcomes of integrity risk management, where you aren't just firefighting, but where you are just building a better and more resilient business. Do you start to see that business integrity itself can be seen as a form of impact or value addition at that portfolio company level? And given that you're also in the world of impact investing, do you see companies buying that argument?
I think that's harder to prove quantitatively. And I think a lot of so in my investment work, is it seen as a value addition, or is it seen as like doing an audit, or a compliance work? Honestly, it's probably seen as doing an audit, but I do think what Rajaa was saying about if we see a company that's willing, let's say in Nepal, not all companies are fully aware of best practice in ESG, compliance, corporate governance, they're not. But are they willing to embrace it, or are you forcing it down their throat? That is one of the things we really look for in the investment decision. In fact, that's the thing we're looking for in the investment decision. And so what we find is a company that tends to quickly embrace ESG, for example, will quickly embrace business integrity. If they keep their accounts and file their accounts on time, they're probably good at embracing ESG. So all of those risks, which is why we, and I know Rajaa's firm, have sort of bundled this now together into one compliance department instead of having separate ESG, separate business integrity, separate corporate governance. So I can't prove that our companies are more profitable, for example, because they practice business integrity. I think what I can, to an extent, prove is that by providing capital to companies, not just capital, but the kind of frameworks, and I have to say BII's business integrity team, as one of our LPs in our second fund, have really helped us lift the game on the frameworks that we can apply to our investees. So what that is helping them doing, you were asking me about competition before, and intuitively, yes, competition itself in a systemically corrupt market will just fire more corruption. Let me say that again. Competition in a market in the absence of a compliant investor, like an impact investor, everybody will be bribing to reduce costs, right? The innovation is only, I'm a coffee bean seller in a market, I'm going to bribe to reduce my taxes, I'm going to bribe. So the innovation is this vicious cycle. What changes that to a virtuous cycle is a compliant or an impact investor with business integrity, ethics and frameworks that says, actually, you can innovate by investing in technology. And as long as your perceived profits are greater than the cost of compliance plus the benefits you will lose by engaging in corruption, then you will take that money and make those extra profits. And you start to engage in the competitive process and spin the wheel the other way by investing in technology, better management strategies, or whatever. So that's what we are doing it for compliance and ethics, but we're also trying to set companies up strong enough to start to turn the wheel in their industry itself.
So that's a tall order, more integrated approaches, and then pushing the wheel the other direction by sort of bringing together this argument of better financial returns, better development impact, better integrated approaches. In terms of next steps and looking ahead, I mean, the report, Ingrid, calls for this sort of sector collaboration approach, this idea that numerous compliant investors, to use Tim's language, come in and start to operate in this way and then share knowledge, etc. Do you want to speak a little bit about what else we should be looking ahead to as next steps?
Sure. So I think one of the things that has come out of the discussion is that ability of impact investors that have enough weight to set social norms or expectations of behavior or shift existing norms. So as Phil mentioned with the Bribery Act, that created a new kind of reference group or a group of investors that were expected to act with integrity, to not bribe because they could get into trouble elsewhere, that then could set standards of how business should be conducted. And I think impact investors have a similar weight to the ability to set or shift social norms towards integrity, and that should be done at the outset, as as Rajaa mentioned. Another point that the report also talks about is a more comprehensive pre-investment due diligence. So not just look at the company itself, but the environment more broadly, as we've discussed. And then there's also an element of supporting the investees of establishing the right structures to mitigate the risk. And very importantly, actually, that those structures don't necessarily have to remain static. There are new risks that are emerging, there are new challenges. So tracking and monitoring of both the changes in the environment and the risks, as well as the adequacy of the controls is very important. And again, I think the report also talks about, and a lot of investors do invest in companies that are not perfect at the outset, but do commit to changing certain aspects of it. And I think all too often, as long as they commit and sign up to that, yes, we'll change that, that's kind of parked and that's kind of a deal done. But really following up on those changes, and are they still adequate given the situations? And I think finally, it's quite important to share the lessons of what's worked and what hasn't. So both among impact investors and development organizations, others that are interested in doing similar work, but also creating a forum for investees to share lessons themselves and to actually talk about how they've approached issues, how they might have failed to respond to issues adequately in that context, but what they can learn from that and what others can learn from that. One of the things we're looking to do is, in a previous project that I did, was helping people plan for bribery requests. So kind of creating a muscle memory of thinking, if you get asked for a bribe or if you get asked to do something untowards in that kind of context, how would you respond? It could be quite difficult to think on the spot about, okay, well, there's that and that. But the Bribery Act can be kind of one point, or just a simple kind of act of asking for a receipt if you're stopped by a traffic policeman. So you're not insulting them by saying, well, you're trying to ask for a bribe or something, but like, yeah, sure, of course, I'll pay what I do to pay, can I just get a receipt? And sometimes that can throw off the other people. Of course, we're talking about much larger, much kind of higher scale corruption, but something like that of creating a forum where investees can share experience could be quite useful.
We've done quite a lot of work with some investees to almost build a budget for that endless time lag while you're waiting for a permit, for example, to clear because you've refused to pay the bribe, and that you'll only be ready to do that if you have planned for that financially and sort of acknowledged and put aside that budget for those few months that are lost in waiting. So it is about having that muscle memory and plan in place. So I think I do want to end with that acknowledgement and sort of bring it back to something that Alex had alluded to, which is, that we're asking quite a lot more of impact investors in terms of, dedication of resources, a shift to proactive management, broadening the sort of understanding of business integrity from sort of counterparty risk at a company to endemic corruption issues in operations and entire markets, but recognizing that they have the ability to influence that. And so it's worth their time. And I'm sure some of the questions we'll get from the crowd right now will start to pick up on what the ask here is. But certainly one of the things that will help make that more digestible will be some kind of common framework or common standards, which we still lack in this space. So something, again, to look ahead to is, do we need that sort of clearer framework for what business integrity would look like for an impact investor seeking to do all of this work in thinking about it more broadly. But with that, I'm going to turn to the crowd for your questions. Feel free to raise your hand. We have two volunteers, colleagues from our BI team with mics who will come up and bring the mic to you. And feel free to direct questions to anyone in the panel. And also, of course, to Alex or Colin if you have something for them based on their introductory remarks. Thank you.
Hi, Chaowen Q from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We've been talking today a lot about impact investing, but I think what we've seen recently, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, is the advent of impact disinvesting, which is, after the fact, disinvesting from certain markets or sectors where the risks can't be mitigated. And I guess my question is, do we think that the principles that have been espoused in this new report would have helped in guiding the investment in Russia or other related markets to prevent this massive disinvestment? And what is the next area where there could be impact disinvestment and that we should be looking out for? Is it China? Like, how will these help us foresee these issues in the future?
Excellent question. And I think we're seeing this not just in the Russian context, but even in the climate space, where there's an argument that if you walk away from something because it isn't green enough, chances are it'll be picked up by other investors who have less concern with environmental issues. So, you know, what should the level of exposure be? Tim, do you want to take a first stab at that?
No, not really, because that's a huge question. It's a brilliant question, and it's very much that. So if public investors, I think it is related, I can't answer on Russia, but if public investors, pension funds, endowments, are going to pull out of public stocks, they're going to be taken up, especially now with the demand for gas and oil, by private. They're going to be taken private with even less oversight. So how is that helping the climate? It's a brilliant question, but the potential disinvestment if certain impact targets or thresholds cannot be met.
I would just add that I think the principles that we discussed of preparedness and planning, having alternative plans in place, but also continuously monitoring the situation. Now, in the case of Russia's invasion, that there were very conflicting views from different sides whether that was going to happen or not. But I think the same effect of continuously monitoring the political situation and having those mitigation plans in place, that was, I mean, that's as much, I think, as investors can do, really.
I also think there's this growing sort of recognition that there also have to be responsible exits, so that when you're thinking about issues like development impact or environmental and social governance, that you have to think it through in the exit process as well, and that it should be very much part of your consideration at the point of exit, or whether you will continue to have those gains, not just the sort of commercial return that you get from the exit, but do you have that sustained development impact or ESG impact going forward? And I think if you bring that lens to it, and I think this comes back to what the report is saying, where it's proactively thinking about these issues at every step of the investment cycle. I do think we may still have seen similar outcomes, but they would have been better considered, and hopefully some of those exits, the quick divestments, would have ended up in potentially slightly better hands on the way out. So I think that's a space that's certainly evolving as part of this discussion. And then I think we allude to a little bit in this report, but more to think about going forward.
I would add one area for keeping a very close eye on. It worries me enormously, which is the climate change, the global climate change funding that is being assembled. There's an awful lot of political capital being spent on amassing the amount of money, but very, very little thought appears to be going into how that's going to be spent. It's going to be targeted towards really difficultly controlled countries. The absorptive capacity of those countries to manage climate change funds is not proven at all. And I think that is where sensible and responsible investing could be playing a role in some of these principles, enabling some of that climate change funding to be spent wisely. I just see this as a future crisis that in 10 years' time we'll see mega billions of money that's just being lost because it was just given to countries which don't have the capacity to manage it.
Can I just add one thing? If for anyone that's interfaced with the Green Climate Fund, the most remarkable setup, you need to go through an NDA, something designated, a named bureaucrat in the Ministry of Finance in each country in order to draw down money from the Green Climate Fund. So in systemically corrupt countries, you're giving one person the power to receive potentially hundreds of millions of dollars into a company or a government grant. I'm not saying I have any evidence of corruption, but you couldn't design a system better for corruption to take place. And that is the kind of systems that we have in place for implementing this climate capital.
Hi, yes, Tim Beskerby in the Business Integrity team at BII. So Tim, you mentioned that for business integrity and corporate governance to really work, they need to embrace change and commit. I fully agree with that. How does an impact investee look to assess and monitor that change and commitment? Because it's huge. It's around risk culture. It's around tone from the top. It's around policies, controls, governance. Just wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, and I can give you where it's worked and where it hasn't worked. So, I mean, more practically, actually, Rajaa was saying the thing, internal audits, or hiring an external firm to conduct regular internal audits, training from the top down. We've just upgraded our framework, actually with the support of BII. We use KPMG to really just upgrade to at least create a DOLMA framework. I think it would be a helpful thing to have a DFI-wide, a sort of IFC performance standard for business integrity. But I've seen this work in companies which genuinely want to embrace that. They want to get more and more capital beyond us. They want to grow. They have that. And that's where the success stories are. I've also seen this not work, where they've pretended to embrace it. I've seen that where they actually sign up to everything, right? In our worst example, they'll say, oh, these are your business integrity and ESG frameworks. Yeah, sure, they're great, I'll sign here. Companies that want to embrace them will say, actually, that's impractical. In Nepal, that's impossible. We just can't find the stuff. They'll push back, and that's a positive thing. Where they just sign it, we ran into a huge problem of undisclosed related party transactions, completely against the code, but the company lost a lot of money, we turned it around, it's a long story. But there's definitely no one's an expert on day one. We've strengthened our frameworks. Those that want to embrace it will push back and we will end up with something that's workable. Those that are probably hiding something will just sign it and pretend, in my experience.
I think we have had the same. It won't happen between like a night and a day. It will take time. But most importantly, you have to assign responsibilities at the board of director to get people buying in, as I said before, as all the panelists have said. It's the game changer. If people just sign and say, like he has said, where do I sign? Obviously, you will have problems. We have had problems like that in one of the countries, in one of the portfolio companies we're invested in. And it took us like more time to put them in line and be on the top. As fund investor, monitoring is key. You have to be on top of them. You have to go there physically, visits, have like formal and informal discussions with the teams, because obviously in the offices people won't tell you what is really happening in the company. You have to go out for dinner with them, for lunch with them. It's funny, but it's paying. They feel somehow more comfortable actually in sharing what is really happening in the company. If there are bribes, if there is corruption, if people have heard something from one department or another. These are the spaces where you can really hear from the inside of the company.
Thank you. Donia, up here.
Graham Baxter. I'm on the Board of Trustees at TI UK. In full disclosure, I was chair of the advisory group on this report, so what an excellent piece of work. I did want to add, from a board level, thanks to BII for your support and also to the team who pulled together this great report. My question goes to a point which has been raised by yourself and by others from BII. It's about Section 5, which talks about collaboration going forward. So I'm interested in the role that TI UK can play to make sure that this excellent piece of work lives on beyond an excellent launch and lots of nodding and agreement amongst us who are presumably the willing. Particularly interested in the view from you from the impact investment community, what appetite there might be and how we can stimulate that appetite for standard setting, forums, overhead, let's face it, in what is a highly competitive industry. And also how within that competitive framework we can encourage collaborative behaviour. So in other words, what can we do to make Section 5 come to life?
Question was for Tim and Rajaa, do you want to?
Off you go.
I mean, something that we have experienced, I don't know if really it's relevant, but for us in emerging market has been, again, a game changer for us, is to go through a certification process. For instance, I will pick up on a healthcare investment that we have in Morocco and in Egypt as well. We have actually asked them from day one to go to certification process. You pick up whatever you want. ISO certification are a good stamp of quality. We have been looking at, for instance, healthcare ethical principle that the IFC has just published in June 2020. So we're trying actually to push our investees to work on that, to align against this principle. And I mean, it has prepared the ground for them to work more efficiently toward these aspects. So for us, maybe it's not the best way to do it, but going through these certification processes somehow is a stamp of guarantee that the stuff that we're looking for, like development that we're seeking to get, is happening.
I think it is helpful as long as it's formed before it's implemented. Like there are lots of standards on corp, so ENS is done. It's the IFC performance standards, at least for developing economies. What we would worry about is being involved in a sort of Betamax versus NHS, you know, what was the other one? VHS, thank you, sorry. So, you know, and we've seen this with some gender things and some impact metrics and, you know, you do it our way, but we've got, 10 LPs and we've got to manage all of these. If it came sort of fully formed from the DFIs, yes, I think we'd absolutely embrace it, because I think the most powerful thing that's been said this morning that really makes a difference to us is the UK Bribery Act. As you said, Phil, people know we can't bribe. I'm seeing a similar effect with the IFC performance standards. We turn up with that, oh, they use those. They're serious, we'd better not take the money unless we think we can really apply. If there was something like that for business integrity, I think it would help.
Coming back to that idea of the need for some kind of common language and framework, that's widely accepted.
Morning, Socorro from Transparency International, working in the fundraising and partnerships team. So I've been listening about the different actors that create this ecosystem around impact investment. And I'm quite curious to get your views on, so you have the investor, the donor, then the investee, the implementer, delivering the project. But you have this ecosystem that works in parallel, which focuses or includes the architects or the designers of these deals, those who monitor and evaluate if those KPIs or the milestones are being achieved. And I feel that this ecosystem that works alongside these big actors can also play a role in ensuring that integrity is included from the outset, from the design of these deals. And I wonder who's working with these groups of designers or evaluators, and how can either BII or the DFIs or the community instill this concept of integrity in this part of the ecosystem. Thank you.
I'd say that a key part of that, as we've talked about, is the standard. So if you give a common framework or that can be used to hold those to account, that's a very good starting point, because then you can point to something and evaluate against something. If you show both those who are directly involved and those who are overseeing or monitoring what good looks like, then that's kind of the first starting point, I'd say. Yeah. And that's also something that the report says, and future work, collaboration between Transparency International, UK and BII, something that we could potentially look into. So, yeah.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, did you want to come in?
Just add, I think there would be value, obviously, if you're going to start a kind of collective action mission, you obviously need to know what you're collectively acting around. So I think some common standards or some expression of the broad principles. It doesn't have to be a straitjacket which feels constraining. It can be a kind of a set of minimum standards, if you like. But I agree with Tim that if they're already out there, then one should be working on those to improve those or get them up to the level that we think is the right level. But nobody wants a kind of competition of numbers of different kind of sets of rules that people can work to. In our initiative in DFID, which we kind of struggled to get off the ground, we were doing some things because we'd seen from experience that companies were often quite excited that they had solved a corruption or supply chain problem or integrity problem in their particular market. And they actually wanted to share it because they thought it was the good way of operating. But they had no one to share it with. And we were contemplating setting up a kind of integrity hub which these things could be compiled together and then shared out accordingly. That hasn't taken place. I still don't know whether there is a place where any company that wants to share a success is able to go to. That, I think, could be a valuable addition. Documenting and synthesizing these experiences, both on the success side but also the challenges. If a company is facing a particular challenge in a market where somebody else is also facing it or has faced something which is translatable from somewhere else, I think that sort of a learning centre in that way, which could compile some of these experiences, I think, again, starts to set the gravity around which some of these practices can then get spread into new environments. I think that will be a valuable step forward.
Patrick Rappo, formerly from the Serious Fraud Office, and now a partner in a law firm that does a lot of advisory work to companies. There's obviously a great report here and fantastic work from TI and BII in relation to what investors and companies can do for themselves. But on the flip side of the coin, as Tim was saying, in terms of the public sector side, the competition aspect doesn't work. What's your thoughts as a panel as to what companies can do to try and collaborate with governments or put pressure on the public sector, because that's often the side that's been missing for the last 20 odd years with law enforcement. Legal changes aside, the UK Bribery Act is brilliant, but how does that come about in countries such as Nepal, and how do you get the public sector to change, and what can companies do to do that? So I think probably to you first, Tim, from the academic side of things.
No solution other than where we have seen it is where the regulators, I can only talk about bureaucracy, I can't talk about actual elected politicians, but we have seen some, and I'd say limited, positive change within sectors where you've had this big international investment. Where I wouldn't say policies have changed, but let's say the central bank says, we require 12 bits of paper for you to get, whatever license you need for a bank. And number 13 is anything else we might ask for, right? Which basically means a license to delay you until you give up and hope they hope pay a bribe. So, we've seen things like that taken away. We've seen some simplifications. We've seen it because there has been a realization that with these reforms comes a strong banking sector, which can support the economy. So somehow, somewhere along that virtuous cycle, a governor, some people in the central bank bureaucracy realized it's to their benefit. Somehow they feel better about doing this than having a rampantly corrupt. But this is, I can only talk from how I see the effect of an ecosystem from private sector activity, and I have to say it's very limited. And it's only industry regulator. I've never seen this affect a ministry. I've never seen this, go any further than that. Perhaps Phil working with, we don't work directly with government. I do think taking people out for dinner and getting to know them
It works.
You know, I'll tell you what we do is we choose the good guys and we get to know them really well.
Yeah.
And they could be elected, they could be unelected, and the British Embassy knows who they are and the US Embassy knows who they are. And you just build a relationship with the good guys, hoping that that will make some change. But then the good guys change every 2 years, and you have to get to know a whole load more.
Yeah, I wanted to add two examples that I've seen where businesses or the private sector has actually done a lot on business integrity, the absence of government kind of pressure or requirement. So one is collective action and business membership organizations. So another country with quite a lot of corruption that I worked in, I was speaking to a chamber of commerce, and they had quite high standards for their members, and that was quite well known, having kind of appreciated the benefits of doing business without corruption. And they actually, the only action they could take against businesses who did bribe or did get involved in things they shouldn't have was kicking them out of the organization, essentially. And that actually had a reputational effect on the company that had been a member of this business membership organization and then was expulsed. And that collective action by businesses to lobby the government to actually have more regulation or more appropriate regulation, that did have some effects. The other one was with correspondent banking relationships and the effect that that had on banks and jurisdictions where the regulators were very low. They had additional audits, they had relatively strong controls, or much stronger controls than the regulator required of them in order to maintain that correspondent banking relationship. And I think that also played a bit of a role. There are issues with, of course, de-risking and all of that, but in that case, it really raised that bank's operating standards.
And I think one of the recommendations in the report is for impact investors to start thinking about business integrity at the outset as part of investment strategy. And I think that's a recommendation that can also apply at a company level, where as long as it's part of your sort of basic business plan, strategic planning, it can save you a lot of long-term cost and hassle. And an example of that was just last week, I was talking to one of our investees based in India who is expanding a sort of health tech platform and has actually done a mapping of all the Indian states just to see which ones have sort of state level regulators that have already gone digital for the permits process, and they are now planning to basically have their expansion plan align with that level of increased transparency, and they've just sort of cut this hassle out by thinking about it early enough. So I think there's quite a lot in here that applies obviously for investors but also for the companies that they're investing in as well.
But there's an interesting point that I add on that digitization, that one of a person I know who also had to get a driver's or register a car digitally, and she actually came across the issue that the people who had digitized it just took off the apply button and said, okay, that's going to cost you that much to put it back on. So, you know, you think that just if you kind of add the technology, like there's still a human design somewhere there, and for a year she couldn't use her car because she refused to do that, and she got direct calls from that person who had actually digitized the system. And then she got a call from an agent who was asking even more to actually do that. So, yeah.
You have to understand your environment no matter what. I think we have time for one last question here. We'll wrap up then.
Hi, everyone. My name is Frida Owino. I work with Control Risks, and I'm based in the Nairobi office. I think it's timely that I'm the last I'm the last one asking a question or making a comment. I'd just like to make an observation on Section 5, which is the recommendations and sort of next steps. So in 2019, we collaborated with the FID and the British Chamber of Commerce in Kenya to come up with a business integrity guide for the Chamber's members in Kenya. And what came out of our report was a training module that now all new members of the BCK in Kenya have to take as part of their onboarding process in Kenya. So some of the questions that we were answering and topics that we were considering is, you know, the local operating context, so setting the scene for that specific jurisdiction. And this is important, both for you as the investor, and for you to take particular consideration for the investee companies. So this could be things like bureaucratic challenges or perceptions of corruption in the country, and down to the language, how corruption is talked about, what local words, how will a policeman ask you for a bribe? If you go to the ministry, for example, is it a look? Is it a term? How will you know that that they're asking for bribe or facilitation payments, for example? And we also considered the susceptibility of companies in various sectors and the degrees of corruption that they were to face. So I think as a next step, and I know that BII has one of the most comprehensive business integrity considerations in terms of political exposure, in terms of ultimate beneficial ownership. So, and you're just mentioning digitization. So if this is something that can be considered, and making it easy for trainees to go through in a module, then this is something that could be considered as well, and also just ensuring that there's that consideration for the respective markets. How we navigate corruption in Kenya is not the same as Nigeria or South Africa. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it comes back nicely to one of the key points here, which is that proactive understanding of the local context and the strategy. So thank you. And may I now invite Alex to close us off? Thank you.
So we're wrapping up now. I just want to say thank you to you, Huma, and to all the panelists. I think it's been a truly engaging and thought-provoking conversation. You've challenged us to think differently about the role of business integrity and corruption in development. You've also challenged, importantly, us as impact investors to think about our role within that and the influence that we can have. So thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the panel. And just finally to say that for us at BII and Transparency International, we see this report, Investing with Integrity, really as the start of this conversation, right? So it's the kind of what next that we've started to get into in this conversation today. For us at BII, there are three things that come to mind. The first is around this idea of closer collaboration with ENS and DI. So how can we improve on our collaboration there and think about how BI can be better integrated into impact measurement? The second area, I think, is data, which we haven't talked too much about, but I think, is there a role for us as impact investors in starting to gather data from our portfolio companies that's going to help us develop that more practical guidance and where which tactics work, where we prioritize what we're doing in the BI risk management space. And the final area, which we have talked about quite a bit now, is this idea of convening across the industry. So how can we support that convening of impact investors to come up with common standards on how we approach business integrity? So if you're thinking along similar lines and you're interested, then please get in touch with us. We're very interested to carry on the conversation with other partners. What we'll be doing is early next week, sending everyone that joined today an email with a recording of the panel, the full report, importantly, and then our contact details if you want to follow up. So if you're interested in carrying on the conversation, please do. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you.